Start today with the Second Continental Congress, okay? Now, we said back in our previous lecture that the delegates that went to the First Continental Congress agreed that they would get together again, especially if the British government did not meet their demands or change their ways towards the colonists. And so because of our incident at Lexington and Concord, they decided they would get together again, and they did so on May 10th, 1775. So on May 10th, 1775, delegates again got together. They met in Philadelphia, and this meeting became known in American history as the Second Continental Congress. Now, this one will be a little bit different than the first one, because they're madder. Does that make sense? They're more irritated because not much has changed on the British part from the First Continental Congress to the Second Continental Congress. And because some of the delegates are mad, we even deem them as radical, okay? And someone that's radical is a person that favors extreme changes, okay? If you're a radical person, you're going to favor extreme changes. And what I mean by extreme changes is changes that are so uncommon on what you normally do that people deem you as radical. You have a radical opinion. And so you're going to have some radical delegates there. Well, you're also going to have some conservative delegates there. And each of them are going to give their opinions in the Second Continental Congress. And a conservative is someone that's cautious, that is not really into change, likes the status quo, has to think things over before they make a decision, those types of things. Whereas radicals are dealing with emotion, they are favoring extreme change. So first of all, I'm going to give you an example of the radical delegates and who led the radical delegates, in other words, spoke for the radical delegates at the Second Continental Congress. And the person that did speak on behalf of the radical delegates was Patrick Henry of Virginia. Patrick Henry of Virginia. And he will represent the radicals, and he's going to speak on their behalf and explain that the radical delegates want some extreme change or extreme action. And I'm going to give you the three examples of extreme action that Patrick Henry of Virginia and the radicals called for at the Second Continental Congress. What might be the first extreme action they talk about? And take into being that this would be something we haven't talked about. That would be a big change in what they're doing now. So what might be the first thing they're calling for? Anybody want to take a guess? Yeah. What do you think, Cord? What would they be calling for? They're tired of the British, so they might be calling for what? The I word. Independence. So the first thing that the radicals called for was that they believed that the colonies should declare independence from Great Britain. That was an extreme change. And we'll get into reasons later on why many colonists were apprehensive to do that. And there are good reasons. Okay? Now, remember what they do to British officials, Jaden, so far when we talk about. What are some things that the patriots or rebels in the English version, what are some of the things they're doing to British officials?
Destroyed their homes, tarred and feathered them.
Okay, what else did they do?
They attacked them.
They did. But have they ever kidnapped or seized them? No. Well, that was the second extreme action that these radicals were saying is, hey, we need to seize British officials in America. In other words, basically kidnap them, seize them, take control of them. They hadn't done that yet before. They had burned and damaged their houses. They had assaulted them, but they had never seized them or kidnapped them. So they even went to that radical opinion. And what else might you do to help yourself beat England if you get in a war with them? Who might you enlist the help of?
Ally their enemies.
Enemies of?
Britain.
Britain, because we really, you know, America really didn't have any allies, right? They're British citizens, so their allies would be whoever was loyal to Britain, maybe. But they went after Britain's enemies. And they said, why don't we ask both France and Spain for assistance? That was a radical thing to ask for at the time. So these radical delegates are represented by Patrick Henry of Virginia, and they call for one, a declaration of independence. 2, that we should seize or basically kidnap British officials. And 3, we should send delegates to both France and Spain and see if they will assist us. Certainly they will, because their arch enemy is Great Britain. Now, to give you an idea, and I think you've heard of this in your elementary history class, to give you an idea that Patrick Henry was radical, he's the one that gave the famous cry at the Second Continental Congress, "Give me liberty or give me death." And that's an exact quote that tells you his radical demeanor. So as he ends his spiel at the Second Continental Congress, he famously cries, "Give me liberty or give me death," showing his radical nature. Now, the conservatives had a say too, right? And they were led by John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. He's on your ID sheet. He's going to speak on behalf of the conservative delegates that are at the Second Continental Congress. And what the conservatives want to do is they want to make assurances to King George III. The conservative delegates want to make assurances to King George III. What assurance did Caitlin make and keep today with me? She assured me that she would do what? Turn in her biography before she left for volleyball. Peyton has assured me that that's what she's going to do. Now, she hasn't done it yet, but I'm pretty confident she will. So, if the conservatives are making assurances to the king, they're trying to assure him that they're willing to stay what? To a point. Now, I want you to listen to the quote, because this is what John Dickinson of Pennsylvania said at the Second Continental Congress to basically King George III. He said publicly, conservatives stated they had not raised armies with ambitious designs from separating from Great Britain, but would resist tyranny with force if necessary. This is the assurance or the guarantee that the conservatives gave King George III. Let me read again. They said, they had not raised armies with ambitious designs from separating from Great Britain, but would resist tyranny with force if necessary. So, Leighton, what are they saying in layman's terms to the king?
We don't want to fight you, but we will if we have to.
Kind of. You're very close. They're basically saying, we're not raising armies to declare independence, to fight you, but if you put us in a position, we will use force. So they're saying, if you get your stuff together, England, and quit treating us so poorly, you know, we won't raise arms against you and we won't declare independence. But if you continue this tyranny, we will use force. So that was the conservative approach, okay? And we'll kind of look at that. Now, so do we have the two sides together, the radicals and the conservatives? Are they not two together, really, are they? And they're probably not going to be, because one has a very radical approach and one has a very conservative approach. But one thing they did agree upon, because they felt it was necessary, is the Second Continental Congress approved the new Continental Army. They approved the new Continental Army. What is the Continental Army, Laramie? First time in the American history of the American colonies, they have their own what?
Army.
Or military. Before it's been what? Militia. Colonial militia from each colony. What the Second Continental Congress stated here is we're going to form a military. And it's going to be called the Continental Army. And they will work in conjunction with the militia from each colony. Well, you got to have a commander-in-chief of this new Continental Army. And who do they pick? George Washington. George Washington is chosen. George Washington of Virginia is chosen to be the commander-in-chief of this new Continental Army. Why do you think they would choose him, Lily? Why was he chosen? Now, we haven't talked a lot about him at this point. He's obviously not a president yet, or he hasn't taken us through Revolutionary War. Why would they pick him?
People liked him and he spoke a lot.
They liked him and he was well-spoken, but where did he fit between these delegates, do you think?
It's right in the middle.
Where? middle. He was in the middle. And I think they wanted somebody with level head. Okay? So George Washington will become the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Who's the Commander-in-Chief, Aurora, of the military in the United States of America right now today? Who's the Commander-in-Chief?
Donald Trump.
This guy right here, Donald Trump. The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief of the military. He makes final decisions. Did we have a President of the United States then?
Nope.
No. So really Washington was assuming what would become presidential duties later. So that's the end of the Second Continental Congress. Okay, that's going to take us to something very interesting, and that's the Battle of Breeds, parentheses, Bunker Hill. And there's a reason it's like that. The Battle of Breeds, parentheses, Bunker Hill. Now what I want y'all to do is get your binders snapping here and get that map out that I gave you. It shows Bunker and Breeds Hill, and have that kind of in front of you so that you can understand what we're talking about. It's a very good map. Get that up in front of you. And on that map, see if you can find a city called Charlestown. And then just kind of circle that when you find it on your map or highlight it. Charlestown. Okay, because that's kind of the key to this whole thing. Should be kind of on the left bottom. Left middle. Okay, highlight that or circle it so you know. Now, by this time in American history, the Massachusetts militia was kind of a big deal. Okay? But they needed somebody to be the major general of that, the man that would control the militia totally. Who do you think they chose to be the major general of the Massachusetts militia, Carla?
Henry Knox.
No. Familiar name. Done about everything for him so far. No. Joseph Warren. So by this time, Dr. Joseph Warren has been named Major General of the Massachusetts Militia. And on June 16th of 1775, June 16th of 1775, Warren had gotten the word that British General Gage had ordered an attack on Charlestown. And Charlestown is on your map, and it's a city that overlooks Boston Harbor, right? So on June 16th, 1775, Joseph Warren, the new Major General of the Massachusetts Militia, gets word that British General Gage has ordered an attack on Charlestown, which was a city that overlooked Boston Harbor. Now, if you're Joseph Warren and you hear that one of your major cities is going to be attacked by the British, what preparations are you going to make, Kyra? You're going to try to what that city? Defend it or protect it. And so after he heard this, Joseph Warren ordered 1,000 men to go up Bunker Hill, find it on your map, to dig fortifications on the hill. So as soon as Warren hears about this possible attack by General Gage and the British upon Charlestown, he orders 1,000 men to go up to the top of Bunker Hill and start to dig fortifications on the hill. Julie, if you dig fortifications, what are you basically digging? Trenches to get yourself behind, because they're going to use that hill to defend what? Charlestown, okay? Makes sense, right? Now the reason we have Breeds and then Bunker in parentheses on the subtopic is because these men mistakenly went up on top of Breeds Hill and built those fortifications. Dug those fortifications. They went up the wrong hill. They went up to Breeds Hill instead. Now, Rhiannon, my dear, if you look at your map, which one's closer to Boston Harbor, Breeds Hill or Bunker Hill? Which one's closer to Boston Harbor? Boston Harbor's at the bottom of your map. Breeds. Now, that's a big deal, because where are all the British ships docked? Boston Harbor. And all of a sudden now, the mistake is made by the colonists that they have put their fortification on a closer hill. Not what Warren wanted, because Warren wanted to be on the farther hill from Boston Harbor because he was going to be on the defensive to defend Charleston. Well, when they built those fortifications on Breed's Hill, they now could shoot their cannons, that being the American colonists, from Breed's Hill to the harbor and hit these British ships. So now they're actually not on the defensive, they're on the offensive. And Great Britain sees this as a threat. So what they do is they actually hurry up the process of Britain marching on Charlestown, because he had heard rumor they were going to. There was no absolute. And to prepare, think about this, Warren defends Bunker Hill in a defensive position in case they do. Well, when those 1,000 men put those fortifications at Breed's Hill, now the British see them as on the offensive and a threat that they're going to shoot their cannons at the ships in the harbor. So what do they do in retaliation? They attack Charleston. They come bang. So they really shot themselves in the foot, no pun intended. They initiated the British to come sooner than they would have if they were coming at all. Does that make sense? Because they went on the wrong hill. So the British, knowing that militia cannons could reach their ships docked in Boston Harbor, review this as an act of aggression, and the next morning of June 17, 1775, the British attack Charleston. And by that afternoon, by the afternoon of June 17th, the British have burned Charleston to the ground. They are mad. And they burnt the city to the ground. So Aurora, you are the British. You are maybe going to attack Charleston. And you see that these American colonists have boldly dug fortifications in an offensive position within cannon range of your ships, and now you've taken off and you've smashed Charleston. Where are you going next?
Probably Bunker Hill.
Not Bunker Hill, because there's nobody there.
Oh, Breed's Hill.
You're going to Breed's Hill. And that's what they do. The Redcoats then turn their attention upon the colonial militia on Breed's Hill, and they're going to go after them next. David, my man, what advantage do the colonists have as the Redcoats are approaching Breed's Hill? What's the advantage they have? David, what's the advantage they have? Breed's Hill, what's the advantage they have?
They can only be attacked from that one side,
Well,
right?
well, maybe, but what's the advantage?
You can see them because they're higher up.
They're on the high ground. That's an important military strategy. You'll hear a lot about that in the Civil War. You always want the high ground. So they're on the high ground so they can look down and see them coming. So, David, you're partially right. So what happens is the Redcoats are approaching, the colonial militia has the high ground, and the colonial militia is ordered to hold their fire until the British Redcoats get within 50 yards of them. And where are they again? On top of Breed's Hill. So what are the British soldiers doing? Marching uphill. And they're told to hold their fire until the British get within 50 yards. And then they will give them orders to fire. Well, there's a lot of British soldiers, and pretty soon they get within 50 yards. The order to fire is given. The colonial militia fires at the Redcoats. The Redcoats are forced all the way back down the hill to regroup. That is called the first charge at Breed's Hill. So, pretty easily, the American colonists or militia are able to beat back the first British charge on Breed's Hill, because they've gone up there, they waited, they fired upon them, they went all the way, retreated down the bottom of the hill, and they're regrouping for what? Another attack, okay? Well, one of the men that was crucial in the first assault was little known Salem Poor. Anybody know anything about Salem Poor? Well, Salem Poor was a former New England slave who had bought his own freedom from his master in 1769. Salem Poor was a former New England slave who had bought his freedom in 1769. You don't have to write this down, but he paid 28 British pounds that he saved up to his master to have himself freed. Does he need to be at Breed's Hill that day, probably? Does he really need to be there? Is he considered a British citizen probably all the way? No. But he's there, and he's leading the charge, and he yells out during the first charge, "Stand your ground. If they want blood, let's show them their own." And he makes a big impact on the troops, so to speak, that are defending Breed's Hill. So during the fighting on the first charge, little-known Salem Poor makes a courageous stand against British redcoats. He's a former New England slave who bought his freedom in 1769, and he encourages the militia by hollering, "Stand your ground. If they want blood, let's show them their own." Ironically, he was not the only black colonist there that day. There were about 100 total that fought on Breed's Hill against the British. And just so you know, on a side note, by the end of the Revolutionary War, which is a ways off in our lecture, it was estimated that more than 5,000 slaves fought for the colonies. More than 5,000 during the course of the American Revolution. Sadly, how much good did that do them? When you think about American history, not much, which is sad. So Salem Poor is one of about 100 African Americans at the battle, and by the end of the Revolutionary War, more than 5,000 slaves will have fought on the colonial side. Unfortunately, didn't do much good. Now, who's on top of the hill other than Salem Poor leading them in? Who's right up in the fight? Joseph Warren, okay? And during the battle, he was quoted as saying, "I hope I shall die